Coming up on this episode, the Warriors make their call on Dwight Howard, which wing options are the best left available, and a little bit of a dive into Andrew Wiggins' scoring and how that may be improved this season. Yes, welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. I'm up and about on this Monday morning, Sunday night American time. It is officially Grand Final week here in Australia. We've got the AFL Grand Final on Saturday afternoon and the NRL Grand Final on Sunday. My Collingwood Magpies, who I'm going to be repping all week, we are through to the Grand Final, an incredibly close preliminary final on Friday night against the GWS Giants. Cannot wait. It is unbelievable for my team to be back in a grand final. From a Collingwood perspective, it's been 5 long years, I suppose. I know other fans have waited much longer than that, but hopefully it's a different result than what we saw in 2018 against the West Coast Eagles. But for any Americans out there, I urge you to check out the AFL Grand Final. Should be on, I think, about Friday night, your time. I'm sure it'll be televised somewhere. And you need to get on the Collingwood bandwagon because we have got the only successful American player in the history of the AFL. That is Mason Cox from Texas. He is our ruckman, 213 centimetres. Played pretty well in the preliminary finals, played over 100 games now of AFL. He's the only American to play more than one game in the AFL. So I think as a result, all Americans really need to be Collingwood fans at this point with what Mason Cox has done. An absolutely extraordinary story. Go and search up Mason Cox on YouTube. There's plenty of different documentaries and little clips and whatnot to kind of acclimatise yourself with him and the Collingwood Footy Club. But anyway, let's get on to the Golden State Warriors because we've had some news here over the last few days. So on Friday, American time, the Athletics' Shams Charania reported that the Warriors will not be expected to sign Dwight Howard or any other veteran centre prior to training camp, which obviously begins on October 2nd. That came as a little bit of a surprise to me and to most Warrior fans. The reports that we'd had from Jason Dumas specifically in the days prior were that the Warriors were inching closer here to a deal with Dwight Howard and that the veterans, assumedly Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, and probably Chris Paul as well, had signed off on Dwight being added to the roster for the vacant 14th roster spot. And then obviously we saw the videos and images of Dwight working out in LA with Dre and CP3, which only kind of added to the idea that, hey, this is coming pretty soon. But instead it went the other way with Shams reporting that the Warriors are not expected to sign Dwight or, as I said, any other veteran centre prior to training camp. That doesn't mean that something couldn't happen before the start of the regular season. Obviously, there's a 22-day period between training camp starting and then the start of the regular season on opening night against the Phoenix Suns. So maybe something could still happen. We'll just wait and see. But at the moment, it's unlikely because the Athletics' Anthony Slater also added that the Warriors' top priority now heading into training camp is for added wing depth, which is interesting to me. Obviously, they made their move for Usman Garuba on a 2-way contract last week. And maybe they think that's enough in terms of their big man rotation with Kevon Looney obviously starting, or maybe Draymond Green starting with Chris Paul starting ahead of Loon, but that's a whole different conversation obviously. But Dre, Loon, Dario Saric, Trace Jackson-Davis and Garuba obviously on that 2-way contract. And it's really interesting, if the Warriors do go with wing depth here rather than more big man depth, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of role Jackson-Davis and Garuba play, because that would give a sense to me that, hey, the franchise is pretty comfortable with those two young players, or at least one of those two young players, playing a role for the Warriors in spot minutes, 5-10 minutes every third or fourth game, whatever it is, this season. So it's going to be interesting to see how those two develop and if they get some kind of role under Steve Kerr early in the season as we progress forward here. But as Slater said, the added wing depth. So for me, looking at the options left available, I'll start with one, Toscano-Anderson, who is not a wing, right? He's not a wing. Let's put that out there. He's a 4 who with his recent three-point shooting, he's probably more likely to slide to the 5 and play as a small ball 5, especially in the Warriors system, as opposed to sliding down to the 3. So he's not a wing as such, but we know he's going to be at training camp. We know Kent Bazemore is going to be at training camp. I still do think, and before the Dwight news, before the inkling that Dwight was going to get signed, that, my thought has been that JTA has always been kind of in at the front of the pecking order when it comes to this 14th roster spot, just because of what he provides off the floor more than anything. But in terms of actual wings specifically, I spoke about him before with the reports a couple of weeks ago that the Warriors had held workouts with him, but Jalen Noel is probably the one that is the most talented player of the wings left available. Averaged over 10 points, played a pretty significant role with the Minnesota Timberwolves last season, has played a pretty specific role with them off the bench over the last 2 seasons. So I think he is certainly the most talented and probably the best player available for Golden State as a wing at the moment, but we'll just wait and see whether or not they're comfortable with him. I do wonder at 6'4" whether or not the Warriors need another smaller guard type who is probably going to try and push the minutes over a Moses Moody or a Gary Payton II. Do we really need that as such? I don't particularly think so. But as I said, it's a wait-and-see game. A couple of other options here, players that the Warriors have been linked to. Bazemore, I spoke about briefly there with JTA. Look, he's 34 years old. He's been out of the league for a year. His previous stint before that with the Lakers was pretty bad. I just don't know. I've said it plenty of times this offseason. I just don't know what he's got left in the tank to provide as, albeit in a limited role, yes, but I just think there's better options available than Kent Bazemore. Will Barton is the other one that's held workouts with the Warriors. I don't mind Will Barton, and if they go down that track with him, again, is it a player they need? I don't necessarily think so. I think he just take Moody's or push for taking Moody's minutes, and I'm just not sure that's necessarily worth it. I think Moody has got obviously a lot more upside than Will Barton, and he's probably just as good a player right now as Will Barton would be. But I don't hate it. His three-point shooting has been down the last couple of seasons, but I do think you're getting back into a good system in Golden State with the three-point shooting threats around him. I do think he could get a lot more wide-open looks and therefore bump his three-point shooting back up above league average, which he really would need to do to be an effective player, that's for sure. I don't think defensively he's offering too much at this point of his career, albeit, he might not be necessarily a disaster on that end of the floor, but, his off-ball work, his catch and shoot, cutting to the rim, that's the stuff that's really going to make him an effective NBA player at this point of his career, whether it be with the Warriors or elsewhere. And then a few other players that haven't necessarily been linked to the Warriors by any means, but a potential wings in terms of who's left available here. Terrence Davis is probably the one that interests me the most, just because he's had a couple of really good moments for Sacramento against Golden State in the past. He's just a player that just frustratingly seems to be able to come off the bench and give you 8 to 10 points in a few minutes kind of thing. I feel like he's done that against the Warriors a couple of times. 13 minutes he averaged with the Kings last season. Shot 36.6% from three-point range, so not too bad. Again, he probably feels the Barton mold of, is he really worth it? A little bit like Noel as well. I just, at this point, which players are worth it to be able to, try and push ahead of Moody and GP2 in the rotation? I just don't think that's going to happen. And therefore, as I keep speaking about, I think what you bring off-court-wise is just as important as what you do on-court-wise as well. Terrence Ross, I'm not a big Terrence Ross fan. I'm just not. I never really have been. He's been on pretty poor teams in the past. Played for the Suns, obviously, late last season. Was okay, but I'm just not. He shoots 42% for his career from the field, and he's not really. He's not a defensive presence, and he's not a playmaker. I'm just not a big Terrence Ross fan. He's a good player in NBA 2K. He's athletic. He can dunk. He can shoot. I mean, that's fine, but really his overall numbers and impact, again, I just look 42% from the field and you're not a great defender and you're not a playmaker. What are you doing for me? Not too much. TJ Warren, look, talented player. We all remember what he did in the bubble where he basically turned into prime MJ. But since then, since the bubble, 46 total NBA games. Just injuries after injuries, unfortunately, a lot of foot issues for TJ Warren, which is a shame because, he was an impressive forward for the Indiana Pacers across a number of seasons there and had that magical period in the bubble, which was absolutely incredible. But since then, not too much impact. So really, outside of that, they're the players I've kind of come up with as players that are at least maybe in the conversation. I don't think anyone else outside of that. Stanley Johnson has held workouts with the Warriors as well, but he's a bit like JTA for me. He's more of a 4 who may slide down to the 5 in the Warriors system rather than a 4 that slides down to the 3. So it's just, Jalen Noel, Terrence Davis, Terrence Ross, TJ Warren, Will Barton, Kent Bazemore. They're kind of the players that I've come up with here in terms of the best wing options available. I still think that JTA is probably the player that I would take, but if I was going after that, Noel and Barton would be my next 2 off the list, I think. And then, the likes of Bazemore, Terrence Ross, Warren are probably at the bottom of the list for me. But we'll just wait and see what happens. It's obviously going to be a training camp battle by the sounds of it. JTA is going to be there, Kent Bazemore is going to be there, and we probably should hear something in the next week or so about other training camp deals as players try to battle off for this 14th roster spot. And of course, there's a 2-way contract available for the younger players as well to try and add to Lester Quinones and Usman Garuba. So I've just finished up an article for Blue Man Hoop about half an hour. It got published about half an hour, 45 minutes ago. So go check it out if you haven't already. But it was to do with Andrew Wiggins and his game going into this season. Obviously, a pretty sporadic year for Wiggs in 22-23, playing just 37 regular season games, missing time with injury, missing time with the personal issues, and of course getting that rib injury in the playoffs, which really hampered him late as well. But obviously, from a Warrior perspective, plenty of optimism around Wiggs and what he can provide this season with greater availability. And obviously, with that, the team should just be better with having Wiggs available for hopefully an extra 30 plus, maybe close to 40 games. He's been an incredibly durable player across the course of his career before last season. But just looking into some of the kind of advanced stats on Wiggs a little bit, and particularly to do with his scoring, and we know that, his development from an inefficient scorer in Minnesota to a fantastic off-ball threat, catch-and-shoot player with the Warriors has been absolutely outstanding, and his reputation as a player in this league has just multiplied tenfold in the positive direction, becoming an all-star in 2022, arguably being, was the Warriors' second best player in the 2022 playoffs behind Steph Curry. Absolutely fantastic. Not only that, his work on the defensive end of the ball. We all know the kind of growth that we've seen from Andrew Wiggins over the last few seasons since being traded to the Warriors in 2020. But I just wanted to go into his isolation scoring a little bit because with, Wiggs, as I said, he's gone from inefficient scorer where he was asked to do a lot in Minnesota to, an off-ball threat in Golden State where he's playing alongside Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, the playmaking of Draymond Green as well. And, for the most part, that's a great thing. The fact that Wiggs has, kind of largely removed the inefficient shots from his game, the tough contested mid-range jump shots, shots, off the dribble kind of thing. But I do think, looking at last season, I do think that the Warriors didn't utilize that element of his game enough where by the end of the second round of the playoffs against the Lakers, and yes, Wiggs, had that rib injury, and by the end, he was really hampered by that, and he probably couldn't have helped in any way regardless. But the Warriors really lamented their lack of shot creation and shot making behind Steph Curry, and their offense just didn't produce enough against the Lakers to be able to win that series in what was, still pretty close. 6 games, a couple of those games, particularly game 1 and game 4, could have gone in the Warriors' direction, and maybe the Warriors win. But the big issue was the offense, right, behind Steph. And I just wonder if they could have utilized Wiggs a little bit more than what they did before, obviously, the rib injury occurred. And he's no Kevin Durant, we know that. But I do think that Wiggs, being long, athletic, the kind of talented scorer he is, I think that the Golden State Warriors could utilize him a little bit more in terms of, being able to go and get a bucket, particularly late in the shot clock when the offense is flailing, when there's not too much going. And if you look at his numbers kind of in isolation plays over the last few seasons, there's a real trend that's developing here. So if you go back to the last season, obviously, missed 45 games, we get that. But in the regular season, he was 5th in isolation plays behind Steph Curry, behind Jordan Poole, Klay Thompson, and Jonathan Kuminga. Now, he shot just 26.7% on isolation plays. So not good at all. Not good. And from that, you think, well, why do we want this guy to get more isolation plays? Because it's clearly not working. Well, if you go back to the year before, Wiggs' All-Star year, second best player on the championship team. He was 3rd in isolation plays behind Steph Curry and Jordan Poole, and he shot 39.3% from the field in those situations. And then if you go back to the year before that, 2020-21, he was 2nd behind Steph and shot 47.8% from the floor in isolation plays. So basically the trend is over the last 3 seasons here is the more isolation opportunities that Andrew Wiggins gets, the more efficient from the floor that he will be in such situations. And I just think that we shouldn't pigeonhole this player because he's developed into such a fantastic off-ball threat, a catch-and-shoot guy. I don't think we should necessarily pigeonhole him into that. And him being 5th in the pecking order last season in terms of isolation plays just simply isn't right for a guy of his magnitude of talent. Now, could that shift a little bit this season with Jordan Poole going out? Maybe, but then, Chris Paul comes in and the way that he, runs the offense, his heavy pick and roll style, that's not necessarily going to lend itself to Wiggs getting more isolation opportunity. But, my whole argument here is that I think Wiggs has got a lot more in his bag than just sitting on the wing, cutting off ball occasionally and just then being ready for, wide open catch and shoot 3-point attempts. That is predominantly going to be his game, yes, but I just think, particularly late in shot clock opportunities, I think he's the guy you want to be able to go to. There's less than 10 seconds on the shot clock. There's absolutely nothing going here for the Warriors offensively. Give the ball to Andrew Wiggins. Right, let him make a play. Because I think that he's still got elements of shot creation, shot making in his game that, as I keep saying, haven't been utilized with the Warriors effectively enough last season. Years before that, yes, and probably because Wiggs had to do it more in 2020-21 when Klay was obviously out and because Jordan Poole wasn't the player that he became in his 3rd and 4th seasons in the league. But it's just a little bit of a fascinating, I think, story to follow here as we head into this season is, how much can Andrew Wiggins improve his scoring? And yes, we want to retain the efficiency, and that's probably the most important thing. But, I think, his 17.1 points per game last season could bump up, closer to 20 a little bit and potentially, get back to a second All-Star berth, maybe if that were to eventuate. So just an interesting little subplot, I think, to follow with Andrew Wiggins and the Warriors offense heading into this season. But other than that, guys, that'll be it for this episode. You can catch me on Twitter at POK252. That's POK252. If you haven't subscribed on YouTube yet, would love for you to be able to do that. It would be fantastic. And also follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast. I'll be back in a couple of days. Looking forward to the season ahead. As I said earlier in the episode, we've got training camp opening on October 2, so I'm sure through Media Day and everything like that, we'll get some answers to a lot of the questions that have been surrounding the Warriors this offseason. But other than that, guys, get on the Collingwood bandwagon for this week, the grand final against the Brisbane Lions, and I'll catch you soon.